the Brazilian story. Now, I know that this is going to have a contemporary application. Can you explain what, I mean, I understand it, as we say in French, en diagonale, like loosely, but explain what happened in 2019 and its relevance to what just happened and what is going on now in Brazil.
So Brazil is a country that has been plagued by systemic corruption for decades. You know, when you look at Western governments, you talk about corruption, you talk about one congressman who takes a bribe, or you talk about legalized corruption, right? The way lobbyists fund campaigns and incumbents in order to get legislation they want. When I'm talking about systemic corruption, I mean pretty much nothing in Brazil happens without major companies depositing millions of dollars into Swiss bank accounts of major political officials. That's how politics works in Brazil. And every political party is implicated by it. But the party that had been running Brazil for many years, from 2002 until 2016, was the Labor Party, or the Workers' Party, founded by Lula da Silva. And in 2014, a anti-corruption probe started, and it was started by these young, very zealous prosecutors who, you know, were of the next generation and weren't willing to accept that Brazil was going to run forever on this corruption. And they started digging into this corruption. They started putting billionaires in jail. I mean, like the richest and most powerful people in Brazil. And I was very supportive of this investigation at the beginning, like a lot of people were. These guys became heroes, including the judge who oversaw it, who was sentencing these people to long prison terms, these people who usually had been immune. But after a while, it started looking to very politicized. They became obsessed with putting Lula in prison, even though polls were showing, or because polls were showing in 2017, that he was by far the front runner to be reelected president in 2018. He left office in 2010 because of term limits. He was clearly the front runner. They wanted to put him in prison. They did not want Lula coming back. And I started suspecting that they were starting to kind of cross red lines, that these judges were starting to get high on their own PR. And then in 2019, a secret source that contacted me told me that he had hacked into the telephones of the leading judge, who by this point, the one who sentenced Lula to prison, by this point, he was not just a judge, he was now Bolsonaro's, basically his attorney general, his minister of justice and security. So this kind of quid pro quo happened where this judge removed Lula, the primary impediment to Bolsonaro's winning that election. And then in return, when Bolsonaro won, he elevated this judge to the most powerful position in the country. And the hacker who contacted me said, I've hacked into Judge Moro's phones. I've hacked into the phones of all these prosecutors. And he gave me this huge archive that showed immense corruption on the part of that judge, who had become the most powerful hero in Brazil, and the prosecutors. And we began reporting it, and it was extremely destabilizing to the Brazilian government, because that judge was the anchor of Bolsonaro's government, and the imprisonment of Lula was this kind of symbol of anti-corruption. And my cause was never getting Lula out of prison. You know, my husband's a member of Congress in Brazil. He was never a member of Lula's party. He was a member of a left-wing opposition party to Lula. My cause was never Lula's party or Lula. My cause was that, you know, you cannot have judges cheating and crossing every ethical line to imprison people with no due process. That, you know, he was plotting every day with prosecutors during the trial in secret. So the whole thing was basically rigged. And when we revealed that, it led to the reversal, the nullification of Lula's conviction. He was released from prison. The Supreme Court ultimately nullified his conviction. And that's what enabled Lula to run for president against Bolsonaro as he sought re-election. In this election, Lula narrowly won by 1 or 2 points. And we became, my husband and I, sort of public enemy number one of the Bolsonaro movement for an entire year, because they thought, we were there to just kind of help Lula. And I think the Bolsonaro movement now understands that that was never actually my goal. My relationship with that movement is much, much better. In part because the Bolsonaro movement, for all the fears people had that it would be authoritarian, that Bolsonaro as Brazilian president would be authoritarian, they ended up really being the targets of authoritarianism, primarily from the Supreme Court, which imposed a censorship regime that makes the one in the US and Europe look like bastions of liberty and freedom. And I've been one of the leading, voices denouncing this censorship regime aimed at Bolsonaro and his movement. And that kind of recalibrated how I am understood in Brazil, both for the good, but also for the bad. A lot of members of Lula's party hate me now, even though I'm the reason they got to vote for him for president. So that story was a very intense story. It went on for about 18 months. It culminated in my indictment. They tried to imprison me for it. The Supreme Court intervened and said I have a free press right under the Constitution that prevents my imprisonment. But it, became a very tumultuous story.
It's nuts. It's actually nuts that you have two of these. These are cinematic experiences on their own. You have two of them. And now it illustrates also that like the history of the 2022 election, 2023, whenever it was, of Bolsonaro, it's the dynamic is something like the war in Russia, Ukraine, where there's a lot more than most people are aware of because they only became aware of it within the last 6 months. You get Lula out of jail, which pisses off Bolsonaro, but I mean, what happens with the reverse prosecution now? Like the sanctioning Bolsonaro's attorneys, sanctioning Bolsonaro for contesting the elections. Is this just corruption as determined by whatever the powers that be are? What's the direction of the corruption in Brazil?
Yeah, I mean, my main worry is not the return of the Bolsonaro movement. It's the authoritarianism of the institutions that united in the name of stopping him. It reminds me a lot of what happened in the United States, where it got decreed that Donald Trump was not what I perceived him to be, which was, kind of a aberrational figure comportmentally, but really kind of just a continuation of the American political tradition. The idea that he was some singular evil, a new Hitler, was always completely laughable to me. But most of American liberalism, and by American liberalism, I mean not just the Democratic Party, but a lot of the establishment sectors of the Republican Party, really did come to believe that Trump was this unique threat. And therefore they united. And that was why that video of Sam Harris's just a few months ago went so viral, because Sam Harris expressed what they were all thinking and that has been driving the United States for the last 5 years, which is Trump is such a singular evil that anything and everything we do to stop him, including lying, censorship, imprisoning people with due process, no matter what we do, the ends justify the means, because stopping Trump is such a high imperative. The same thing happened in Brazil. These institutions decided that Bolsonaro was such a grave threat to democracy and everything decent that anything and everything necessary to stop him became justifiable, including implementing a form of tyranny where any dissidents of the establishment, any supporters of Bolsonaro were subject not only to being censored, and I'll just give you a statistic that's amazing. 10 members of Congress, 10 members who got elected by the Brazilian people, including some with the highest vote totals, all on the Brazilian right, are banned by order of the Supreme Court from accessing any social media platforms, even though those social media platforms have found that they haven't violated the rules of the platform. So the most popular politicians in Brazil, some of them are not allowed to use Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Google, anything else. And some of them have been arrested. Journalists are in exile. And, so what concerns me, and it shocks a lot of people on the Brazilian left who thought I was their ally, was that I don't regard anything and everything done in the name of stopping the Bolsonaro movement as justified. I don't regard left-wing authoritarianism as better than the right-wing strain. And this is now the driving dynamic, especially after what happened on Sunday with the sort of their own January 6th. That's obviously now going to be used to say that we have to even come down harder on the Brazilian right. Now, Lula is a very pragmatic guy. He has a lot of challenges in governing Brazil. My belief is that the reason Bolsonaro left Brazil for the United States on the last day of his presidency is because there was a deal made that, look, just leave Brazil, stay quiet, don't encourage your maniacs to wage a civil war. And in return, if you do that, we'll agree not to prosecute you and your kids for corruption. And the Bolsonaro family is pretty corrupt. And I think that was the deal that was made. But now that this kind of happened, this leaderless movement, went to Brasilia, and out of frustration and rage, they didn't kill anybody. There was no plan to overthrow the government. It was very much like January 6th, just kind of venting a lot of, unexpressed anger. They entered government buildings. They did some property damage. It was not a good thing. And now it's going to be used, much like September 11th was, much like January 6th has been, much like every crisis always is, to crack down even harder on civil liberties.